Welcome back to the train room, everyone. Today we have a very special locomotive. This is the Key Imports Pennsylvania Railroad S1 6446 duplex in HO scale. The S1 was a collaboration from the Pennsy, Alco, Baldwin, and Lima to design a duplex drive steam locomotive. This wasn't the very first duplex ever made, but it was obviously the first and only 6446 wheel arrangement ever created. So for those of you who don't know, what is a duplex? In order for a locomotive to be called a duplex, it has to be a locomotive with 4 cylinders and on a single frame. This was a locomotive that wasn't meant to compete with articulateds, but this was meant to compete with 484 Northerns. Now this was the Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive, and the Pennsy was one of the very few, and I think the only major railroad not to have a 484. They had the idea that these 484 locomotives, having all those wheels on the same set of cylinders with all those same rods, would wear out faster. So they figured, why not have 8 wheels, but having them split, where 4 wheels each have their own set of cylinders. So they figured this would be a much more reliable design, and that would enable it to be easier to maintain, and so forth. But in reality, the 484 never had those wearing out issues. They were a very reliable locomotive, and this locomotive proved to be very unreliable. This locomotive cannot go around tighter radius curves. The 484 is not meant to go in really restricted areas, but it can negotiate curves much better than this locomotive. This locomotive in real life had to only operate in straight shot lines. It ran between Crestline, Ohio to Chicago, Illinois. So there really obviously wasn't that many curves in between those areas. This locomotive was also so long that it actually couldn't go to the Crestline roundhouse. They actually had a custom siding built for it because it was just too long to fit around the turntable. This was the largest reciprocating steam locomotive ever made, but that does include the tender. So here's a side-by-side view of the S1 next to the big boy. Now the S1 I know is a proper scaled down version of the locomotive in HO scale. The big boy made by River Aussie, I can't say it's 100% accurate, but it comes pretty close. So looking from the pilot, so the S1 overall is a longer locomotive. However, if you were to count just the locomotive itself, the big boy is a longer locomotive. That means that the tender on the S1 is one of the largest ever made. So, not only did this locomotive have the design flaw of being a duplex, it also had the design flaw of being a 6446. That's why it was the only 6446 ever made. The trouble is that when you put 6 wheels in both the pilot and rear bogie, you're going to have unequal weight distribution. When you consider the locomotive's entire weight, only about 40 to 45% of all of that was placed on the 8 driving wheels. The K4 had 65% of the engine's total weight on the driving wheels. So for the S1, when you have less than 50% of the entire weight on your driving wheels, that's going to cause wheel slip. And that was a very big problem with this kind of locomotive. Not only this locomotive, but the T1 that they had later on as well. And that would be very harmful to the locomotive. You'd have running gear and your wheel tires wear out very quickly. So it's proving to be a huge disadvantage at this point compared to the 484. So at this point, there were less advantages to having the 6446 duplex design. The S1 streamlining is actually very impressive. This was created by industrial designer Raymond Loewy, who also created a couple of other streamlined designs for the Pennsylvania Railroad. If you can sort of see in the background, there's a streamlined K4 there, and that was another design that Raymond Loewy created for them. The S1 was able to show off its impressive look during the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair. It was actually on a set of rollers so you could see the drive wheels move, although the locomotive wasn't going anywhere. So this sort of hid the fact that the locomotive had slip issues. As beautiful as the streamlining is, it unfortunately was slowly cut off when the locomotive was in service. Now this is obviously how the locomotive appeared when it came on the Pennsylvania Railroad, but over time, a lot of the streamlining was cut due to ease of maintenance. And this actually included taking off parts of the pilot as well as all this skirting along here. The tender also had a change in paint scheme, as it no longer had that nice prestigious Pennsylvania scheme to it with all this pinstriping. Instead it was reduced to just a single Pennsylvania lettering, which was very basic looking. So the locomotive was a bit more ruggedized, but it still was very impressive looking. It just wasn't as nice as how it appeared during its first in-service scheme. Due to the design flaws of this locomotive, it obviously did not have a very long life on the Pennsy. It was considered for preservation by the Pennsy. It was still a very iconic locomotive. It was still something of desire to them. It was a big promotional piece when it was on display at the New York World's Fair, but it was really taken out of the public eye when it went into service. So they were considering this locomotive because of all the modern Pennsy locomotives, and I mean modern when they were built after 1930. This was the only one that paid off its debt. So the Pennsy owned it 100%. They could do whatever they want with it. So they were hoping to preserve it. But 1946 was not a good year for the Pennsy. It was the first year that they were operating at a loss. So this meant that they had to cut corners and save where they could. And this unfortunately meant taking the locomotive to the scrapyard. This locomotive was scrapped in 1949. This was pretty much a promotional locomotive for the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was featured in brochures and calendars, and obviously was a big hit at the New York World's Fair. But once it was placed into service, it pretty much dropped out of the public eye. And even though it's scrapped for many, many years, it has made appearances in multiple different items in pop culture. It appeared in a comic book, a couple music album arts, and even in a couple video games. This is a very iconic locomotive with that very distinct Art Deco streamlining. There was no way that this locomotive was going to go silent for what it was in many years, even after it was scrapped. Obviously, this locomotive was really, really amazing enough that it was reproduced in all sorts of scales in model railroading. And this one in front of us is a fantastic model. So, let's get into it. In the making of this video, the S1 has only been made as a brass model in HO scale, and there have been 4 separate releases of it during the time it was made. The first was during the 1960s for Olympia, in 1981 for New Jersey Custom Brass, in 1989 for Key Imports, which is what this one is, and then again in 1997 for Challenger Imports. During the Key Imports run, there's actually 2 different versions that you can get of the S1. You could have this one in front of us, which was the as-delivered scheme, or you can get the de-skirted version, which also has the lettering on the tender down to the basic version. I believe they were both made in 1989. I sort of like to use the analogy that this locomotive is like a Ferrari F40. I'll get into that in a little bit, but that's something you need to understand. But when you think of brass locomotives, you think of really high-end detail. Even though this locomotive is brass, it's a streamlined locomotive, and streamlining usually covers a lot of finer detail. But that's perfectly fine because this locomotive looks exactly like the way the real one was. Obviously you have that very impressive pinstriping and streamlining across the locomotive. You do have separately applied handrails, you got your marker lights, you got your headlights, you have a horn here which I'm not sure what it sounds like. My guess is it would have sounded the same as the GG1. Cylinders look very impressive. The valve gear, running gear, whatever you can see of it, actually looks really, really good. The wheels, they're immaculate. They're black with white walls to them. And one thing about Key Imports during the late 80s, early 90s is it had a distinct feature they put in brass models that isn't too commonly seen anymore. That's coasting drive. I'm not exactly sure how to explain it, but basically the locomotive can actually move without being under power. You can't do this with an average locomotive. Heck, even you can't do that with new brass locomotives. It was a pretty cool idea, because you could actually set the wheels into a position that you wanted to when you had it on display. You didn't have to put it on the tracks and put it under power just to get the rods down the way you wanted it to. It would also be pretty helpful for a locomotive in case there was a section of track that wasn't clean or that the locomotive would lose power because of that. But with coasting drive, the locomotive would continue to roll down the tracks, and then it would eventually pick up power again and just move along perfectly fine. I don't think that's a problem that this locomotive would have because this thing is so massive. It has so many points of pickup that I think you would have to have an incredibly large section of track that would not be able to give you power. I'm doing my best for this, but we're going to take a look at the back head detail here. It's really impressive. Lots of really fine detail in there, exactly how the real one would have appeared. Now, like I said earlier, Daiyoung also produced the S1 for New Jersey Custom Brass, but I don't think that one has back head detail like this one has, and I don't even think that one has coasting drive either, but it's really nice to see the features on this locomotive because that's some impressive back head detail. I'm really happy to see that. Almost as impressive as the locomotive itself is the tender. This is a really nice looking one. Like I said, this is probably one of the biggest tenders ever made. 16 wheels, and that length is really long, which is what made the S1 longer than the big boy. On the back there's all kinds of detail because you got handrails up here, you got them on each side, you have a ladder. Then you also have the knuckle coupler, which came standard in 1989. As well as the coupler yoke and coupler cup bar. Very impressive. Now the wheels, you can't really see them, but actually they also are featuring the white wall wheels as well. So really glad to see that. Here's a look at the top of the tender. Again, really impressive. Now you'll notice that there's no coal load, and that's a common thing that was made for brass. That you had the option of putting coal in there, but they wouldn't actually have it available on your brass models. Some modelers, which were obviously very meticulous, wanted to have the locomotive just when it was fresh and brand new. And obviously brass locomotives are trying to look as impressive and clean as possible, so coal was not a feature in many of these brass models. I'm not sure what brand new ones are like, but it might still stand the same. But either way though, really impressive up here on the deck. This is a very impressive model overall. Now, to have the analogy of why I think this locomotive is like the Ferrari F40 of model trains, here's why. The Ferrari F40 was built in the late 1980s by an exotic manufacturer on a limited production run. This may not be a sports car, but this was also made in the late 1980s by an exotic manufacturer on a very limited production run. I'm not sure how many of these were made because Key Imports is kind of spotty with how many they ever put out. But if I were to guess, probably less than 200 ever made. So this was obviously a very, very desirable locomotive. And to this day, collectors would love to get their hands on. It is a fantastic piece, but like the F40, it's extremely simple. The F40 was a bare-bones sports car, but what it did flawless. It was very fast, handled amazingly, and had a very timeless look to it. Collectors would still love to get their hands on that car. This locomotive doesn't even have an operating headlight. There is no tender light. There is no back headlight. There's no marker lights. It's very basic. But what this locomotive does, it does flawlessly. This locomotive is a very smooth runner. It's very impressive. It looks really good. It's a quiet runner, and overall it's fantastic to see this in operation. Now, I can't run this here in my own layout because I have Bachmann EasyTrack on the floor, and the radius is 35.5 inch, and that's still way too small for this. Like I said, this is scaled down. So this is a true duplex. They didn't make this as an articulated frame. They didn't put this with blind drivers. They made it exactly how the real one appeared. So when you have a realistic brass model, it's going to be like the real thing. There's not going to be any adaptations for it to run on just any HO layout. So the minimum radius for this is probably about 50-inch radius, and it'll barely be happy with that. But in this video I've included clips of it in operation from a couple years ago when I had it on an older camera, hence why this video is in 30 frames per second. With the impressive performance, detail, quality, and of course that coasting drive mechanism, this is an awesome model. Now, like I said, there's a couple of variants of this locomotive in the HO scale brass markets. The Olympia and the New Jersey Custom Brass are good models, but I'd really recommend getting either the Key Imports like this one here or the Challenger Imports one. There are a couple differences between the two. Like I said, this does not have any lights whatsoever. If you want lighting, go for the Challenger Imports one. That one has a headlight, tender light, and I think it even has back headlighting. Very impressive. However, there's a couple sacrifices with that model. You do not get white wall wheels with that, and you also don't get that distinct coasting drive mechanism. That's a sort of like a good or bad thing depending what people want, because some collectors don't want to have the coasting drive mechanism. So depending what kind of features you want in your model, you either go with the Key Imports one or the Challenger Imports one. But either way, both of them are very, very impressive models. So that's about all I have for this locomotive. It's fantastic. Now let me show you what this locomotive is like operating on a layout that can handle this locomotive. So thank you very much for watching. See you next time.
I don't know what that does in HO, like, compare to freestyle. I don't know. He took some of these engines, Grant, and he put this sound in them. I think it was Tsunami Sound or something, decoders. He had these things running so smooth. I mean, it was like a real locomotive. It was really just amazing what he did with those engines. It is neat to see it go slow, too.